Right. So Mordechai is Miradachia. That's the Targum, the translation of Morderor. Morderor means myrrh. Myrrh is the source in the Torah when we're instructed regarding the incense offering. One of the items, one of the ingredients in the incense offering is morderor, and that is the source within the Torah for Mordechai. As we said, everything originates in the Torah. So we got some over here also. Oh. So everything originates in the Torah. Looks like somebody's at the door. Security officer's on vacation. Oh, he's there? Thank you. So everything originates in the Torah. So therefore, Mordechai has to have an origin in the Torah. Mordechai's origin is the word Morderar, translated as Miradachia. So the source for Mordechai in the Torah is myrrh, which we established is the musk deer, which is not a kosher animal. Good morning. Which is not a kosher animal. The question is when it's the blood of this animal that congeals, and then it becomes a perfume. And the question is, once this blood is transformed into this perfume, does the substance itself become kosher, or just we're allowed to benefit from the smell? There are two opinions. So that's the technical side of things. The spiritual side of things is Mordechai is the one that inspires the humility, the alignment of the Jewish people to God. What does alignment mean? Alignment means that I put God first. The human condition is to put ourselves first. That's what we call ego, self-centeredness, self-interest. Doesn't even have to be that ugly. It's just the nature of things. Human beings are preoccupied with self. When we have the humility to direct the self in the service of God, we transform the self. This is not complicated, right? I want to do what I want, but instead of doing what I want, I'm going to do what God wants, which means I've harnessed the I, in this context, the animal within myself, to be in service of God, becomes transformed. The question is, when that transformation takes place, is that transformation a complete one, or is it a harnessed one? That's the discussion. Why specifically blood? Because blood is passion. Blood is the life force. It's the driving force that gives our body life. So when we take the life force of our body, the life force of the I, and we direct it in the service of God, so then that blood is now transformed, right? So it parallels the myrrh and the transformation of the blood of this musk there into an ingredient in the incense offering, a sweet smelling offering to God. When we bring those things together, we create transformation, and that parallels the journey of the Jew to transform themselves. Who inspires this transformation? Who inspires this alignment? That's our leaders, our Jewish leaders. Particularly in the story of Purim, it's Mordechai. Mordechai is the leader, and he is Mordechai HaYehudi. As we said, HaYehudi, the word Yehudi, represents the idea of Yehuda or Modeh, which means to recognize or admit or acknowledge God, right? So following the whole thread, I wake up in the morning and I'm preoccupied with self. I access that part of myself inspired by Mordechai to recognize that I'm only here in service of God. And then in so doing, I take my blood force, my energy, the drive that I have within me, and I can commit to using it in the service of God. And this beautiful thing just happened. I took this life force, this energy, this blood, and I made it holy. That's the story. And by the way, whenever you bump up against something, whenever you bump up against the tension in life, you're bumping up against an individual relationship. You're bumping up against a health matter. You're bumping up against a financial matter. Why do we get worked up about these things? Because we disconnect them from God. Right? We say, I was actually thinking about it this morning because there's a family member who did something or didn't do something. They didn't share information. And I just found out about this from a third party. And it's a pretty significant thing. And I'm thinking to myself, like, why didn't this person share it? And I started getting worked up. And I tried to lean into compassion first, right? My first stop was compassion. Okay, the reason they didn't share it is it wasn't malicious. Even if it was malicious, it wasn't malicious, right? It's their mishigas and it's their hang up. And it wasn't calming me down. So I went to the next step and I said, God's in charge here. God's in control of the situation. So even they're a sidebar, they're a side note to the story. This is where God wanted things to be. So why am I getting agitated? And the reason we get agitated is because we disconnected from God. And if we can get back to alignment with God, we don't get agitated. And when we don't get agitated from a circumstance that we encounter, not because we practice some kind of personal development, but because we anchor it in God, we create transformation inside ourselves. It's a very powerful idea. If we can see the body in terms of energy, divine energy, we're able to make that shift. I'm just going to cool it down in here because I'm getting worked up already.
I understand your analogy, but in that analogy, if you didn't experience what you did, it's like then it'd be a common response, I guess. In other words, if you say, okay, it's God, that only means you feel like maybe I should help, it may put you on the sidelines. It could be like you're on the sidelines. It takes you out the court.
Yeah, so two things. Yeah, you're asking a very important question, and I think we are wired to go down the path that you're saying, but I don't think it's kosher. Let me explain what I mean. First of all, if we don't have the ideal response, we become very self-judgmental, right? We say, oh man, why didn't I think about that? Why did I get agitated? No. You got agitated because you're human, because you have an animal soul, because you do have a blood force, a blood drive inside of yourself that's animalistic. That's normal. And there's nothing wrong with that. It only becomes something wrong if you act on it. On the contrary, when you don't act on it, because you go through the thought process, you're a very holy person. That's a very holy journey to go through. That I experienced something inside myself, I got worked up, but instead of spending a lot of time thinking about it, let alone saying something, let alone acting on it, I chose to go through the process of trusting in God and recognizing God in the equation. Boom, that's what it's all about. Now, and the Alter Rebbe actually writes in Tanya that when we judge ourselves for that, we're actually engaged in false arrogance, in misplaced arrogance. Why? Because who doesn't get agitated? Who doesn't get agitated at all? Who would you imagine doesn't get agitated? Okay, that's one. Good. What's on the opposite extreme of dead people? Angels or the tzaddikim, the very righteous who have already worked through that. If you get frustrated with yourself that you got agitated, who are you? Are you a tzaddik? Are you a perfected person? You're not a perfected person. And the proof is because you got agitated. So if you got agitated, it's a proof you're not a perfected person. And therefore, why are you pretending like you're something you're not? So I got agitated because I'm not a perfected person. And frankly, that's where God put me. God didn't make me, as the Alter Rebbe establishes in Tanya, that the perfected people, the tzaddik, is a predetermined to be at that level where we no longer have an animal drive. That belongs to people that God has chosen. The rest of us, we could be righteous in the sense that we don't have to act on our agitation. But the inner system that we're going to be agitated, that's the human condition. That's where God put you. Okay, now, if God is part of the equation correctly, then you do ask the next question. So what does God want me to do? But you're asking that question from God's vantage point, not from the vantage point of what do I want to do. In other words, when the tension comes into my consciousness and I begin to get agitated, if I respond to that agitation just spontaneously or animalistically, that's not holy. By the way, you may come to the same conclusion on how you should act. But if you come to that conclusion because you reacted from an animal place, then it's animalistic. It's not holy. But if you come to that conclusion because you went through the process, you recognize God's in the equation, and then you say, what does God want me to do? Okay, great. Now you're acting from a place of anchoring. And that makes all the difference, which is such a powerful idea because many actions are neutral. They become holy when they're driven by godliness, when they're driven by humility and divine alignment, and they become unholy at worst, but neutral at best, when they're just spontaneous reactions. So actually anchoring ourselves in God actually motivates us to do the right thing, and the actions that we take and the thoughts that we think and the speech that we engage in becomes very holy. Okay, and he then drew a parallel to this idea with the principle that there's a question when somebody does teshuvah, if somebody repents or returns to God, do the intentional sins become erased? Do we look at them like inadvertent sins, or do they become positive actions? And the Alter Rebbe said that the parallel to this is the answer to this, the two opinions, parallels the two ideas, whether the blood is transformed or it's just in service of. If you say that the blood is transformed, so then the intentional sins are considered positive deeds. And if we say that the blood is not transformed, it just is a contributor, it's in service, so then it's as if the intentional sins become mistaken sins. In other words, at best, we'll ignore them, we'll erase them. Why does an intentional sin become a positive deed? Because it's at that very energy, it's that animalistic energy that drove us to engage with God in a way that we wouldn't have had we not had that animal drive. In other words, because I have an animal drive, we had a fellow over yesterday in the afternoon, very interesting fellow. I think we're going to end up having him speak. He wrote a book called Trash Talk. Not trash talk as we usually think of it. Trash talk, he basically he posits the idea that there's a culture in the human condition of speaking, which is about creating attention to help others and to help ourselves grow. You might say like debate, but debate is very benign, like a high school debate. But there's idea where people, he used another example, like there's a competitive roasting, right, where two comedians get up and they go at each other. The tension, right, the tension of this engagement forces the other person to figure themselves out more, to uncover inner qualities. If we didn't have an animal drive, this is maybe not so familiar, but I'll in the yeshiva world, right? In the world of observant Jews, the tzaddik in many communities is idolized, right? The perfected rabbi is idolized. In Chabad, it's not idolized. In Chabad, the struggler is idolized. Not the struggler who's constantly failing, but the struggler who really struggles. He's at war with himself. Why? Because what we learn from Tanya is that the perfected person is not something that most people will ever attain. It's not the human condition. And it's essentially decided by God who those people are. And they're really here just to help others. That's not real people. They belong in a trophy case, you know. And they're important. They serve a purpose to help others. But I haven't encountered any. I've encountered plenty of strugglers. And the people that I respect the most are not the tzaddikim, they're not the people who've arrived, they're the strugglers. Those are the people I respect. Because I can identify with that. I identify with the struggle. And I find it heroic that people who struggle make the choice over and over again to do the right thing. That person is the one that's taking the real stuff of life. They're taking the human condition and they're directing it in the service of God. That's holy stuff. So when a person faces their stuff, they face their animalistic drive, and they choose to use that in the service of God, then the drive itself becomes a stepping stone in the relationship with God. And you have this in human relationships as well, right? Sometimes you do something wrong in the relationship. So there's two ways to respond to it. You can respond to what I did wrong in the relationship as, oh man, I'm sorry, I messed up. Or you can say, oh man, I disconnected from the relationship. So if I say, I'm sorry, oh man, I messed up. Okay, so you fix what you did wrong, but you're not a changed person, right? But when you realize that in the act you disconnected yourself from the relationship, then the act itself becomes a stepping stone to strengthen the relationship. As we gave the analogy, the wrecking ball who comes to take down the house before you build a nicer house, that's not destruction, that's building. It's the first step in building. Okay, all this makes sense? Good. Hello, good morning. Okay, let's go to bottom of page 49. If anybody wants a copy, their copy's up here. Any questions on this? Any thoughts? Agreements, disagreements? Yes.
Remembering the Torah story well enough to connect Mordecai with the characteristic of Israel. Are there midrashic stories about that explain Torah more fully, or is it just what we have in the Megillah?
There are definitely midrashim, but it's the basic story with a little flavoring from the Medrash. And the basic story is, why was there a decreed against the Jews? So the Medrash tells us that Achashverosh, the king, threw this feast, and at the feast he served non-kosher. At the feast he used vessels that had been taken from the first temple at the time of the destruction of the first temple, and the Jews fraternized with the Gentiles. And they put their hope and their faith in the king instead of in God. Furthermore, many bowed to Haman. So when the decree was imposed upon the Jewish people, Mordecai stepped up, and it says that he gathered 22,000 Jews, and together they prayed and they studied Torah. But the Medrash tells us that no Jew from the time of the decree, no Jew had a foreign thought to abandon Judaism. And Chassidus emphasizes this, that the decree in the Megillah, just like Mordechai is Ish Yehudi, the decree in the Megillah was against the Yehudim. That's how they're called in the Megillah. And the reason why the Megillah tells us that the decree was against the Ish Yehudim was to tell us that the faith of the Jew, this idea of Yehuda, this idea of alignment and acknowledgement of God, was awakened in the Jew, and not one Jew abandoned that, even in thought, during that year. So we see how Mordechai as a leader inspired this in the people. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Moses was told by God, do this, do that. Something as important as this, and what Mordecai determined to do, how did that come to him?
Say the question again.
Moses, like the analogy, God told Moses to take up the right thing, he told him to do this, do that, right? In this situation, Mordecai, such a big thing to align, big responsibility to align to this whole process to connect. So how did that come down?
Great question. The way I hear you asking the question is, the way I hear you asking the question is that God spoke to Moses. God told Moses what to do, and Moses did what. Where did Mordecai know what to do? And I think the answer to the question is really the essence of this discourse, right? The Jewish people at Mount Sinai took up acceptance of the Torah because God was revealed to them. In the story of Purim, God was not revealed to them. There were no miracles, and yet they chose to maintain their faith in God, their commitment to Torah. Mordechai actually represents the leader who is worked through. His faith in God is something that he worked on. He achieved that. He achieved that level on his own. In other words, the messaging for you and me is much more in line with Mordechai than it is with Moses. I would never imagine myself being like Moses. I'm inspired by Moses, but Moses, you're right. God talks to Moses. I'm not saying that I could ever be a Mordechai either, but Mordechai represents something that's a little bit more attainable and more inspiring. He's a down-to-earth person who has unbelievable faith in God. And he has a conviction that he'll never bow down to Haman. And that's inspiring. It's inspiring to those people. If God was revealing himself directly, then the people wouldn't need Mordechai.
Just wondering, is the Purim story after the age of prophecy? Could he have been a prophet?
I think he is listed. I do believe he's listed in the list of prophets, but we don't find communication between God and him. The prophet, the era of the prophets ended right at the beginning of the Second Temple. Mordechai definitely lived in that era, and if I'm a guessing man, he probably did have divine communication, but it's not in the text for a reason, because that's not the story.
And even if that were true, it would be at a lower level than the revelation to Moses.
Surely. Nonetheless, our sages say that Mordechai in his generation was like Moses in his generation. In other words, both his closeness to God and his influence on the people was akin to Moses in a different format, but nonetheless. All right. 49. Middle of the page. Mordechai, who we identified before as pure myrrh, that is, that he is the source of this alignment with God. In Kabbalistic terms, it means that he is the attribute of Yesod within the Sublime Father. Let's read the text here. The Sublime Father refers to the sphere of Chachma, which is identified with Bittul. I'll elaborate in a moment. Yesod is the sphere associated with the quality of connection. When we speak of the Yesod of Chachma, the reference is to the dimension within Chachma that connects with other qualities and infuses them with the quality of Bittul. So, very broadly, we have 10 sephiros, the spiritual building blocks of the divine cosmos, and ultimately all the way down to the physical reality. The spiritual building blocks are known in Kabbalah as the 10 Sefirot. The word Sephira means to count, it means to shine, it means sapphire. Okay. The first three are intellectual: Chachma, Bina, and Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. The next 7 are emotional: kindness, discipline, harmony, endurance, bonding, humility, bonding, and royalty or nobility. The 3 intellectual, Chachma, Bina, and Das, are the intellectual process. We We look at the microcosm of the person and we understand the functioning of the cosmos. So within the person, we have a genesis of an idea, that's chachma. We have the development of idea, that's bina. And then das is the application of an idea. So you use your brain to inspire emotions that then translate into action. Okay? That's the broad introduction. The specifics we're going to focus on is chachma. Chachma is the genesis of an idea. So the easiest way to understand what he's telling us here is when you have an innovation of an idea, the innovation leaves you wanting. It asks a question. What? What is this all about? Give me more. I don't have it. I don't have it yet. Right? It's a couple of simple analogies. You're listening to a class, you're reading a book, you're watching a show, and then something comes in your mind. Oh, this is reminding me of something. Oh, this idea might solve something, and then you're trying to figure out what it is, and then boom, it clicks for you. This idea and that question that I had the other day, this solves that question. Right? So that first experience, does this experience, do you identify with this? Right? We have that feeling sometimes. And by the way, we know that if we don't pause to take care of that feeling, that notion, it goes away. Then we say, oh shoot, what was I thinking about? What was I just thinking about? Right? Because you got distracted. But if you actually stay on the thought, the thought is asking you a question. What is this? What is this? And then when you click it, then you have the birth of an idea, and then you have to still develop that idea, right? So I imagine, people who are sitting in a lab researching something comes to them in the process of the research and say, oh, wow, I think I got something here. They're not sure what they got, but they got something, and they're trying to figure it out, and then boom, yes, I think this theory aligns with this test. Let's get into it. And you start testing it and you start playing around with it, and it builds until you say, yes, we got something here. There's something to work with here. So the initial experience is chachma. And the word chachma in Hebrew spells out two words, koach ma, which means it's a power. It's the power of what? Meaning the power itself asks what? It's an energy of what? The whole nature of chachma says what? Bina is development. That's where the idea gets developed. Once you already have the idea, that's where it gets developed. By the way, the reason why it's called father is because Bina is the mother. You have conception, is the birth, is the moment of conception. But if the seed is not captured by Bina, by the female, it goes away. But just because you have a seed and you have a fertilized egg, it doesn't mean the project is done. Now you have gestation. Bina has to invest itself in understanding and developing the idea. And then when the idea is complete, then you have das, then you have birth, and you have new life, you have transformation. But that's the process. So chachma, in terms of spiritual divine service, chachma is the energy of what? And what is the energy of what? That's humility. When I say what, I'm demonstrating humility. I don't know. That's why I'm asking what. Once I know, I don't ask what anymore. I say, I know. I'll tell you what, right? I'm the guy answering the what when I know. But chachma asks what. So chachma, okay, so that's in the human experience. In the cosmos, in the spiritual cosmos, chachma represents the divine energy that elicits humility in the recipient. So one who receives chachma, if you experience chachma, it calls to you for humility, calls to you for alignment. Okay, that makes sense so far?
Elaborate a little bit more. The humility process, the ability to accept inspiration or
Yes. And any time one suspends themselves or aligns themselves with something more than them, that's an experience of Chachma. So I'll give you an example. You walk into a room where there's a professor, or it doesn't even have to be a professor. It could be some techie guy who's explaining, the function of a particular. We had an interesting conversation yesterday around this fascination in apparently there was a major breakthrough in the last week or two from Elon Musk's laboratories with the ability to plant a chip inside the brain of someone suffering with ALS. And so there's a Chabad rabbi in Southern California, Yitzi Horowitz, who is ALS for many years already, surprisingly. And he actually writes a weekly essay. He's totally paralyzed. He writes it with his eyes. So there's a computer screen, and he looks at the screen, at a keyboard on the screen, and the keyboard responds to where he's focused, and it pulls the letter. Okay, imagine writing, I don't know, a 500-word essay where every single letter you have to look with your eyes to type the letter. It's unbelievable. But here's the craziness. So this breakthrough is where they plant a processor inside the person's brain, and the processor processes the person's intention of where they want to put their eyes. So they don't even actually need to do the work of looking at the screen. Just the fact that they're thinking about the letter produces the result. Is that crazy? Now, okay. Now try to think about how that works. How is it that you take a computer chip, right, a little piece of metal, and you put it inside the brain of a human being, which is made up of meat and neurons and guts and cells and all kinds of bodily matter and electrical impulses, which are produced by the body, and a computer chip can then translate it. Now, if you were a techie, it would make sense to you. I'm not a techie. To me, the whole thing is outrageous. It makes no sense. Now, if I walked into a room and there was, maybe you're even doing this right now, but you walk into a room where there's somebody explaining this, what is your relationship to this experience? It's like, whoa, what are you talking about? What is this? And if you really wanted to understand, and you thought you were capable of understanding, you'd ask questions. So the response to that, to the Chachma response is what? You're experiencing a light, you're experiencing an energy that evokes within yourself humility. That's on an intellectual level. Now let's move it out of the space of intellect. You walk into a botanical gardens and you see the most beautiful flowers and trees and plants that you've never seen in your life. What are you experiencing? And you're not a botanist. What are you experiencing? You're experiencing awe. Like, what is this? Right? So it's not intellectual per se. You're experiencing a light that evokes within yourself a humility, a suspension of self. Because if you were walking into a room where the person speaking is someone from your profession, and you have just a little bit of an ego, you're going to walk in there and say, okay, yeah, you don't really got it. Maybe you understand it, but I also understand it, right? It's not pushing you to humility. You're already engaged in your own process of evaluation and judgment, right? So Chachma evokes humility, whether it's intellectual, whatever it is, but it's a light that produces a response of humility. Make sense?
It's an aspect of wonder.
It's an aspect of wonder. In fact, the yira, awe of God comes from Chachma, as opposed to love comes from Bina. Because love is also says in Tanya, when I want to tell you about the love that I have for you, what do I say? I love you. It starts with the I. In other words, this is my experience of my love for you. It's not about you, it's about me. Even if it's about you, it's about the I loving you. As opposed to awe it's not even I'm afraid of you or I'm in awe of you. there is awe here. There's something grand here. That's the dominant energy, right? So Chachma evokes humility. And the result of that is alignment, right? The result of that is alignment, meaning there's something I need to learn here. There's something bigger than me here. There's something greater than I here. Okay, now let's move to the next part. The next part is Yesod. So in the emotional manifestation, right? Once you have the intellect developed, so then we apply it in emotion, right? So you have chesed, which is kindness or connection. You're attracted to something. Gevura, which is discipline. You create boundaries and so on and so forth. We also need connection in everything that in any manifestation of the divine experience or the human experience. One needs connection. What do I mean by connection? You can't understand something unless you become present in it. You can't have a relationship with something unless you're connected with it. Now, how much you're connected is going to really determine how deep and profound the relationship is going to be. So whether you're studying something, you need to invest yourself in the study. If you're in a relationship with another person or with your children or with your parents, depending on how much you bring to the table, that's how deep the relationship is going to be. But if you can't be in a relationship with anything unless there's connection there. Yesod, which it translates as foundation, Yesod is the connection point. In other words, in terms of the manifestation of the divine cosmos, Yesod is the connection point that connects the divine revelation to whatever it is that the light is connecting to. Whether it's angels, whether it's physical reality, whether it's any of the spiritual levels, Yesod is the connection point. So now, Mordechai, so within the 10 Sephiros, we have fusion, right? You have fusion. As we said, Chachma on its own disappears. The energy disappears. So the Chachma needs to fuse with Bina. It needs to fuse with the development of the idea. Conversely, the development of the idea needs to fuse back with the Chachma. It has to lean back into the innovation. Otherwise, it goes awry, right? If you're developing something and you forget why you're developing it, it just goes crooked, right? You can have love for someone or something, but you're not connected to it. The love's not going to be sustainable. If you have awe of something and you're not feeling connected, then the awe is going to dissipate. So connection is absolutely necessary, and so it is. For example, I'll give another example, classic one. You have kindness and discipline, right? So we have kindness in discipline and discipline in kindness, right? If a parent is disciplining their child, but it's not rooted in love, it becomes abuse, right? It's the very same act becomes an act of aggression as opposed to an act of love. Conversely, you can love someone and you're not really loving them, you're loving yourself. You don't have enough boundaries to hold you to actually say no, right? So the true love oftentimes is saying no, not saying yes. If I really love you, I'm not going to give you that bowl of ice cream right before bedtime. It's not good for you. But it's uncomfortable to say no. Yes, that's why I'm saying no, because I love you and I'm doing the uncomfortable, right? And so on and so forth. And you can see this in all of the spheros. I'll give you one other example. You have endurance, right? If you commit to a certain path in life, but you don't have the quality of endurance, you may have everything lined up. It makes sense to you. You got all the right emotions in the right place, but you don't have commitment to it. So it falls off the path. So you need to have endurance. You'd have to be able to stay the course, right? So we have fusion of all of the spheros in each other. And by the way, parenthetically, right now we're in the period of the counting of the Omer, between the second night of Passover and the holiday of Shavuos, we count 49 days. Part of the process of the counting of the 49 days is a process of self-refinement, which mostly takes place in the emotions, in the world of emotions. Each week, there's a dominant one of the 7 emotional characteristics, and each day of that week is how all the other 7 are manifest in that one. So the first week is chesed. So the first counting is chesed in chesed. The second counting is gevura in chesed. The third one is tiferes in chesed. If you go to a website, Toward a Meaningful Life, Rabbi Simon Jacobson, you can actually sign up for his, he sends out a daily email throughout these 49 days with what is the application of each one of these 49 fusions. So last night we counted 21 days, so we completed 3 weeks. So last night we counted Malchus of the 7th of the 3rd. It's probably like a good mathematical 7 to the 3rd power, right? The 3rd one is Tiferes. So it's Malchus, it's nobility within harmony or within compassion, within beauty. Okay, but let's get back here. So Mordechai represents the attribute of Yesod, of connection within Chachma, within the manifestation of this level that evokes humility. Why? Shechachma hi koyachma. This is what I mentioned earlier, that the word chachma is koyachma, means a power of what? Right? Those are the letters, meaning ma, what, is the power of humility. And as we learned in a prior discourse, ubechachma is bariru. It says in the Zohar that chachma is the tool that refines, which is also very basic. How do we create any change in life? We create change in life not by saying I know, but by asking what. Right? If I know, then I don't need to change. I'm there. If I'm asking what, that means I'm ready to change. So when your spouse tells you, hey, by the way, you got this thing you got to work on, right? So the human condition is to say, oh, me, I'm perfect. I don't need to make changes. You're the one that needs to make changes, right? But if you have humility, then you say, tell me more. What is it that I need to change? Let me understand what it is that you're seeing that I'm not seeing. And then I can work on that, right? So the question what, and by the way, same thing as we mentioned many times, you have a piece of food that you want to elevate, right? If I'm just drinking it because I'm thirsty or I'm hungry or I like the taste of it, great. But if I pause and I say, what is it that I'm about to do? That's a question of humility. What am I about to do? What is this experience there for? Why did God give me this experience? What am I supposed to do with it? Then we can choose to embrace the experience in a certain way, and then we create transformation. So the energy of Chachma is the tool for transformation, the tool for refining. Ultimately, we'll go into Bina. We'll develop it. We'll figure out a game plan on how we're going to do it. But first, we have to have the humility to say what, right? When I make the blessing on the cup, that's the action or the speech. If I take the parchment and I make the mezuzah and put it on my door, I'm doing an action. If I'm contemplating the greatness of God, I'm engaged in thought. But before I do that, I have to say, what is this all about? Why am I, what is the purpose of this cup of coffee? What is the purpose of this parchment? What is the purpose of this experience? What is the purpose of this challenge? And if I'm asking what, then I begin the process of refining. So that's what the Zohar is saying, is with Chachma, we refine. Chachma is the tool for refining. So again, Chachma is humility, and the question of what is this for, which is ultimately the tool for refining, is also an expression of humility. Now, Mordechai, let's think of Mordechai for a minute as an energy, as a channel for divine empowerment, okay? Even though he's a human being, and even though we're all human beings, but we all are really fundamentally just channels for divine empowerment, right? What are we doing here? We're channeling the divine into our human experience, right? I'm not trying to get woo-woo here, because you can touch your hand and you can feel that you're actually a human being. But that's the beauty of it, is that our physicality is a home and a channel for divine energy. So what is Mordechai? What is he as a leader? He's a channel for divine energy, but a very specific type of divine energy, Yesod of Chachma. He is the channel of connection of this power of humility. So Mordechai is the one who creates connection for the Jewish people with the dimension of godliness that evokes humility within them. And the result of that is a generation of people who, in the time of crisis of the decree of Haman, kept themselves aligned with God. Makes sense? It's beautiful and powerful all at the same time. Let's read the text here on 50 before the next section. As implied by the connection with Musk, Mordechai epitomizes the transformation of evil into good. Since this transformation is achieved through Chachma, Mordechai is identified with this quality as the officer. Remember, we said the Megillah calls him Ish Yehudi. He's the officer of this Yehudi, of this quality of humility, the officer of this humility, the officer of Bittul. Mordechai's mission was to infuse the entire Jewish people with this quality and empower them to carry out such transformation. You know what's so beautiful about this? Amongst the things that are beautiful about it, is that if we can embrace this as a concept, not only in the story of Purim, but in life in general, we change the way we look at people in general and the people that come into our purview, right? Because why is that person in my purview? Why is that person in my life? So from an unhealthy place, we talk about all of our resentments and all of our blockages and all of our ego. But when we shift and we say, whoa, they're a divine energy and they came into my purview, in some way, there's a question to be asked, which is what? What? I'm saying why, but it's what? Why are they in my life? What am I supposed to do with that information? What am I supposed to do with that experience? It's a game changer. Everything in our lives is structured for us. Like the Medrash says that a person is obligated to say that the whole world was created for me. It's actually true. That's the revolution of God's oneness, is that the entire world, everybody in this room, I'm sorry to say, maybe not so sorry, you guys were all created for me. But by the way, you need to say the same thing. Everybody in this room was created for you. How could both be true? If you're all created for me, how can I be created for you? Because that's God's greatness, is that his oneness is manifest in every type of fragmentation. So you have to live your life with a recognition that everything in your purview was created for you to serve God. And I have to live my life that way. And it's true. It's not just a nice personal development brain hack. It's actually real. Actually is meant to be. And then I can begin to live life. I can begin to live my purpose. You feel me? Okay. Any questions? Comments? You say we take a little break and digest this? Yeah, this is the juice of life. It's the juice of life. All right, let's keep on going. There's more juice. Middle of page 50. Now, okay, so we've established the role of Mordechai. One of the things we just spoke about is the idea that when we encounter tension, when we bump up against something, that's God's way of talking to us, right? So what did Mordechai bump up against? What did the Jewish people bump up against in the story of Purim? They bumped up against Haman. That's what they bumped up against. Now, before we analyze what is it that they're bumping up against, oftentimes you can know the essence of what it is that you're bumping up against by recognizing what are you being called to do. If you're being called to love, then it means what you're bumping up against is the antithesis of love. In other words, the agenda is to help you call out love. If you're bumping up against a lack of awe, or a lack of commitment, or a lack of bonding, or a lack of self-dignity, in any of these circumstances, so you know that what you're bumping up against, it doesn't mean the person. Sometimes it is the person, right? That's if the person's a negative being. Meaning, what do I mean by negative meaning? I don't mean that they have a negative attitude about life. Meaning they're not yours. You know, you're walking down the street and somebody says some anti-Semitic slur. We don't have to. It's not about the person. It's what am I going to do about it? But when your child or your parent or your spouse, you're bumping up against them. I'm not saying that they are the antithesis to love. I'm saying is that the event is the antithesis to love, intended to evoke within you greater love. If someone is poking you in a way that's making you not want to have compassion for them, that's a sign that you need to find compassion, because that's what that event is about. So if the Jewish people are being called to humility and alignment with God, that means that Haman is the exact opposite of that. Right? Make sense? So let's see. One of the classic lines in the Megillah takes place in chapter 6. Beginning of chapter 6, we read the story that the king was having difficulty sleeping. If you remember from earlier on in the story, so Mordechai, who understood multiple languages, was stationed around the palace, and he heard two guards whose names were Big Son and Seresh, not Big Son and Little Son, but Big Son and Seresh. Big Son and Seresh were plotting against the king. So Big Son and Seresh conveyed Mordechai conveyed a message to Esther that these two guys are plotting against the king. Esther communicated that to the king. They did an investigation. They found indeed that Big Son and Seresh were plotting against the king. They had Big Son and Seresh killed and removed. And the king wrote in the royal book of Chronicles that Mordechai gave this in intelligence to the king to save the king's life. Now it's the 6th chapter. The decree against the Jewish people is already in place. Esther and the king and Haman had already had their first feast. And after that feast, the king is sleeping. He's having a hard time sleeping. So what does he do? He calls for the book of Chronicles, bedtime stories, royal bedtime stories. And the person there begins to read the stories. The Medrash says that he kept on trying to turn away from the page where the story of Mordechai didn't want to highlight the Jew, but the angel came and kept on pushing the book back. But the bottom line is, he reads this story to the king about Mordechai. So the king says, oh my gosh, Mordechai saved my life, and my guilt must be racking me. I can't sleep because we never took care of him. We never honored him. Now, just so happens that after the meal, after dinner that Esther had with Haman and the king, Haman comes home, and on his way home, he sees Mordechai. And Mordechai refuses to bow to Haman. So Haman thinks to himself, this lowlife, look at me. I'm the greatest guy in the kingdom after the king. Who was invited to dine with the king and queen? Me. And no one else got invited. And this Jew refuses to bow to me? So he comes home and he tells his wife. He says, what's the deal with this? Like, what am I supposed to do with this? So his wife, Zeresh, tells him, I have an idea for you. Go and build a gallows. And in the morning, you'll go to the king, and you'll tell the king that you want to have Mordechai hung. The king will accommodate you. So somehow or another, in the next little bit, he builds these gallows. And then he goes to the king. He's going to spend the night there. So the first thing in the morning, he's going to get his anger addressed and get the king's permission to hang Mordechai. His arrival to the palace, to the royal throne room or the royal bedroom, happens exactly at the time that the king finishes hearing the story about Mordechai. And the king says, what should be done to the man that the king wishes to honor? And the guard says, guess who's just arrived? Haman. The king says, send him in. Haman comes in and the king says, I have a question for you. What should be done to the person the king wishes to honor? So what is Mordechai's response? So these are the words. I'm sorry, what is Haman's response? Thank you. What is Haman's response? He says, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Okay, so we have the whole answer right there. If Mordechai is about awakening humility in the Jewish people, alignment with God, and the antithesis to that is Haman, Haman must be the antithesis to God. He's the opposite. He's about arrogance, about disconnect from God. Where does this manifest? What is, I don't want to call any of us a Haman, but the antithesis to humility is the question, is the comment of thinking that everything revolves around us. Not in the way I mentioned before from the Medrash. The way I mentioned before from the Medrash, I didn't tell you the rest of the sentence. The Medrash says that the whole person is obligated to say that the whole world was created for me. And what am I created for? I was created in order to serve my Creator. That's the epitome of humility. Yes, everything here in my life was created for me because I'm here to serve God. So what am I really saying is you are here so that we can serve God. That's humility. That's the ultimate in humility. Every physical reality, every physical consciousness, every element of somethingness that exists in the world is there for us to serve God. The antithesis to that is that the whole world really revolves around me. The sun rises and sets on my thing. Right? That's the opposite of holiness. Haman epitomizes it in his sentence. Lemi yachbeit hamelech lasais yikar yeser memeni. Who does the king wish to give honor to more than me? Of course me. Because the whole world revolves around me. I'm the most important thing in the world. That's Haman. Where does Haman come from? Where does he originate from? Amalek. Haman originates in Amalek. Who's Amalek? Amalek is the people who challenged the Jews as they left Egypt. And Amalek in the spiritual cosmos represents the absolute fusion, infiltration. In other words, if the positive qualities is about fusing all of the emotional characteristics in the service of God, Haman is about fusing all of the emotional characteristics in the service of self. And that's what Amalek is, and Haman originates in Amalek, and therefore we have this evolution and this manifestation to be continued next week. Sorry to leave you on a cliffhanger like that. Any questions?
It makes you wonder what was the state of the Jews when they needed to have something to transfer. Again, where were they? Never land. They had no idea. Makes you wonder, like, example what you're saying, like something had to happen. They needed something, or what happened, right?
Yeah, I would say that we are held to a higher standard. So disconnecting from God doesn't have to be radical. It just has to be enough that God is not center stage. And that's where they were. Yeah, they're always available on the Intown Jewish Academy YouTube channel. Click on the channel and then go to live, and then you'll see the classes there.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Everybody have a